The Mexicans who understood what this plant was, they would use it as kind of a prejudicial basis for prejudice, you know. Oh, look at those people that are smoking that dope, you know. Here we go, over here drinking shots of rye and tequila and stuff like this. The United States, being an alcohol-based, has always used THC-based societies. Their use of THC is kind of that which set them apart and made them subhuman or lesser human beings.
The first laws against the use of marijuana were enacted in the early 1900s in the southwestern states along the Mexican border and in Louisiana, where West Indian sailors had introduced the smoking of marijuana into the nightclub and early jazz scene of New Orleans. By the 1920s, marijuana use was showing up in other urban areas, and a campaign against reefer madness had emerged, featuring sensationalized films and newspaper accounts describing how honor students became crazed or homicidal after smoking a marijuana cigarette. With very little evidence of widespread use and no clear consensus on the health effects of smoking the plant, the U.S. Congress, at the behest of the Bureau of Narcotics, passed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 to discourage all cultivation of the cannabis sativa plant by imposing an occupational excise tax on anyone engaged in the commerce or cultivation of cannabis.
The operative part of the Marijuana Tax Act was a transfer tax, and for transferring it pertained to the leafy part of the plant as far as the transfer tax, and there was a fee of $1 an ounce if it was to be transferred to a registered participant. But it was $100 an ounce if it was to be transferred to an unregistered participant.
Registered participants included the manufacturers of paints and varnishes who used hemp seed oil in their products, suppliers of birdseed, and the manufacturers of medicinal products such as corn plasters and various remedies used by veterinarians. Unregistered participants, it was assumed, would be marijuana dealers. Though it was alleged by the prohibitionists to cause unwitting citizens to commit violent crimes, the politicians who had seen the complete failure and subsequent repeal of the prohibition on alcohol a few years before stopped short of outlawing cannabis outright. But even as a tax, the legislation provided the government a large measure of control with very real penalties for those who failed to comply.
Now, pardon me, I don't think marijuana was a problem back in 1937. It certainly wasn't a problem. It's certainly not a problem today, and it's all over the place. So I don't know how it could possibly have been a problem in 1937, except for the fact that when they passed that law, for the first time, the federal government took over the right to tell you what seed you could plant in the ground and what you could do with the product of that seed.
Simultaneously, what was happening from a commercial perspective is that industrial hemp was really losing its stand here in U.S. agriculture. There were a lot of other alternative fibers that were coming in. We had a lot of manila hemp coming in, which is not cannabis sativa. We also had sisal coming in from the Orient, cotton coming in from the Middle East, abaca coming in from Southeast Asia, as well as a lot of synthetic materials, particularly during World War II, that were coming in to supplant the price effectiveness or competitiveness of industrial hemp in the commercial agricultural market.
The hemp industry did undergo increased scrutiny as a result of the tax, but the law provided an exemption for the stalk portion of the plant, requiring the few farmers still growing hemp to register with the Treasury Department. But a token payment of a $1 a year occupational tax was all that was required to keep producing hemp. The campaign against marijuana, which originated with state and federal law enforcement officials, was bureaucratic in nature and hysterical in tone. It succeeded largely because it circumvented any attempts for a true public or scientific debate on the issue. The prohibitionists deftly fused marijuana usage with the deep-seated racial fears and the isolationist tendencies of America in the 1930s, and the result was the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. 1 year after the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, an article in Popular Mechanics magazine predicted the unprecedented reflowering of hemp culture. It observed that new uses and the recent development of improved processing machinery were about to bring the nearly extinct crop back into the limelight, replacing the numerous foreign fibers and creating a new billion-dollar cash crop for the country's farmers. But what no one predicted was that in less than 4 years, more than 14,000 U.S. farmers would be under contract to the federal government to grow hemp on 178,000 acres of prime farmland. Like the First World War, the outbreak of World War II halted the importation of hemp from Russia and Italy, and once again hostilities somewhere in the world caused a resurgence of America's hemp industry. This time, however, conditions worsened with Japan's entry into the war, cutting off America's principal source of fiber, abaca from the Philippines, commonly called Manila hemp. The situation threatened to limit not only America's buildup of military forces, but also impede the growth of wartime agricultural production.
It was desperately sought to help save the lives, first to make parachutes, and equally to have rope sufficient. And then they found out those little U-boats, 2-man German subs could shoot a hole in the ship, but it wasn't too devilish big. So if they take a hemp rug and drop it over the side, they could pump enough to save the troops' lives.
By the spring of 1942, a major government-sponsored campaign was in full swing, hoping to persuade farmers to grow the fibers so vital to the war effort. A corporation, War Hemp Industries, was put in place to purchase the crops and manage the operation of some 70 processing sites proposed for speedy construction in Kentucky and throughout the Midwest. The hemp-marijuana connection was, for the most part, forgotten during this period, though participating farmers were required to register with the U.S. Treasury. By the end of 1943, the world's shipping situation had eased to the point where large amounts of sisal were being imported from British East Africa, and U.S. stockpiles of fiber began to return to acceptable levels. With the emergency over, the government began dismantling the hemp program, and production quickly decreased as foreign fibers began to dominate the market once again. Since the participating farmers had not invested heavily in the venture, there was little resistance to ending the program, and most simply returned to growing more profitable crops like corn and tobacco. In the span of a few years, the U.S. government had gone from condemnation to adulation in their public relations campaigns for and against the cannabis plant. As the war came to an end, the crop which had been cast as both criminal and war hero looked as if it were headed toward extinction once again.
After World War II, because the U.S. government had reauthorized industrial hemp production, although it had failed to a certain extent in terms of helping, quote, the war effort, several farmers continued to raise industrial hemp for commercial purposes through the 1950s and even into the early 1960s. However, at this time, because of the growing awareness of the drug problem, growing trade in drug use, growing evidence of drug abuse here in the United States, we made the production of industrial hemp illegal once again. This first happened in the 1950s, but some of the laws that were put in place weren't very clear. There were some loopholes around them, etc. So farmers continued to raise industrial hemp for the next couple of years, but commercially it was a failure, and legally they continued to get themselves into trouble. So it really pretty much collapsed in the early 1960s.
67, Kentucky threw the baby out with the wash. They just said, boom, anything to do with hemp, including the plant of the seed, is wrong, illegal. Then the feds got smart and came along, 68 or 70, somewhere. And you wonder why the people quit roaming and looking for it in the country. They found out they got more headaches than they did highs, because it's a feral plant or a wild plant which came from the seed. The seed will stay in there or something for a very long period. It wasn't doing them much good. That's the reason it's become the largest of all crops in America, but it's treated horticulturally rather than agriculturally.
Exactly where it came from and how it got to be a part of our society from the 60s on is it's unclear. some people theorized that it was the soldiers who came back from World War II. You know, a lot of them had served in the South Pacific and in a lot of the tropical and subtropical countries where marijuana was still a part of life there. It was part of their religion, part of their customs, and so when the soldiers came back, some of them brought that custom back with them.
At the end of the Korean War, World War II, they really came down on it. Life in prison for a joint. They really suppressed it. They didn't want all these soldiers discovering THC and coming back here, having discovered it. Same thing at the end of the Korean War. At the end of the Vietnam War, not only did they lose their control of war-making apparatus and the way to make war, their inability to control the Vietnam War was also mirrored by their inability to suppress this plant with the soldiers when they discovered it over in Vietnam. And so they bought it back and turned on my generation to it. I was turned on to marijuana by a very good friend who was an airplane mechanic in Bangkok, Thailand during the Vietnam War. He came back with a duffel bag full of it and says, "Here, try this." And I trusted him. He later became a doctor. I knew he was smart. I knew he knew what he was doing. He turned me on to marijuana, and bless his heart, saved my life.
When I was in college, in the graduate school down in Stanford, going through the writing program, we lived in a little community called Perry Lane. And one of our good friends and neighbors was a guy that was enrolled in the drug experiments that were going on in the VA hospital. He didn't really want to do it. Psychologists, by their nature, are cowards. They wouldn't be psychologists. So he said, "Here, you go and do it for me. You get $20 a day. You have to go in every Tuesday at about 8:30. They give you something, and then they test you with test your urine and your blood sugar. They test your reflexes. They see if you can add and subtract. About every hour, they'd come through and do this stuff. And where they were doing it was on the ward in the old Menlo Park hospital, a VA hospital. And when I looked out through this little window, one of the little windows that have chicken wire inside of the glass, and looked out there at the ward and saw these people out there, I realized that these people knew something that the doctors didn't know. They were crazy and they were in pain, but they were enlightened in some way. And the villain that they were seeing, and they could sense the thing that was driving them crazy, it didn't have anything to do with Freud. It had to do with America. And they had all followed the correct lines. They'd all been vets. They'd all had good jobs. And something wasn't working. Something was haywire. And they knew it. And either they had to become unpatriotic or just go ahead and be crazy.
In the 1960s, it was a really interesting time period because there were two different cultures that were running parallel to one another. And in many ways, they were really parallel because rarely did they cross. And when they did cross, it usually created some sparks. The one culture was the little home in the suburbs with the polyester suits and the synthetic life of two cats and a dog in the garage and the whole bit. And then there was the counterculture, who was really, I think, pursuing more the natural way of life. They were trying to become more grounded, more environmentally conscious, and more concerned about the things that they were putting into their bodies. And so at that time, drug use took, I think, an interesting twist in that a lot of people were very interested in psychoactive experimentation and turned to a lot of chemicals like speed and acid, for example. But there was also a very strong movement at the time to move into the natural things of life. So at that time, people began to be very interested in marijuana, also very interested in natural clothes, cottons, flaxes and linens and silks and wools, things that were more consistent, I think, with their kind of back to the woods, simple lifestyle.
Hemp, like tobacco and so many things with farmers, is is really a victim of the weather. A good season, everything works right, you got a super quality fiber. If it's not good and things turn out